1/3 of Pakistan is underwater after record torrential floods swept the country. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has called it the worst in its history. More than 1,000 people have been killed so far, livelihoods have been destroyed, and 33 million people displaced. Fears of further flooding, particularly in the already devastated Sindh province, are real. Is it now time for the top polluters in the global north to step up and take responsibility for the climate catastrophes of the global south? Hello, welcome to Roundtable. I'm Hazem Seeker. Experts have blamed global warming for the extreme floods in Pakistan. But the country is responsible for less than 1% of global emissions. Some argue this is climate injustice and are demanding reparations from larger emitters in the global north.
Wealthier countries are morally responsible for helping developing countries like Pakistan to recover from disasters like this and to adapt, to build resilience to climate impacts that unfortunately will be repeated in the future.
Climate scientist Fahad Saeed says the floods are absolutely a wake-up call to governments who keep promising to tackle climate change at successive UN conferences. COP27 will be held in Egypt this year, and many will be watching to see if the world's major climate polluters will finally act. Well, joining us now on the panel to talk more about this is Shozab Raza from Toronto, a postdoctoral associate at Yale University and an editor at Jamhoor magazine. In Cambridge, we have Aisha Siddiqui, assistant professor in human geography at the University of Cambridge. And joining us from Washington, D.C., El Yaboki, international security expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good to have you all with us. So, Shozab Raza, let me start with you then. Climate apartheid is what this is being called, what we're seeing in Pakistan and going beyond that to other parts of the world. Does the West owe a debt to the rest of the world then?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I definitely think because of this climate apartheid, the West, and particularly the global North, does owe forms of reparations to the global South, because it's important to connect, I think, this apartheid, this climate apartheid, to histories of colonialism and imperialism that have left, and these are processes that are ongoing of imperialism and colonialism that have left countries in the global South resource-starved, poverty-stricken, and therefore unable to deal with climate disaster, they don't have the resources, the infrastructure to invest to deal with when the floods do hit. And so there's a historically sedimented kind of forms of resource starvation in the global South that is due to colonialism. And because of that history, I think the global North owes forms of reparations to the global South.
But this is also right now climate related, the floods we've seen in Pakistan. And Aisha Siddiqui, just talk us through how that has contributed to the terrible floods that we've seen in Pakistan, and how this could be represented elsewhere in the world. And in that sense, does the West need to do more to help reverse that, given that they are the largest contributors to what's happened with climate change?
Yes, absolutely. And within kind of an understanding of disasters, what we always say in social sciences is that no hazard by itself becomes a disaster, right? There are these underlying conditions of vulnerability, and we've just heard about some of them. And those underlying conditions of vulnerability make hazards or leave populations extremely exposed to hazards. And in the case of Pakistan, Shazab was absolutely right. It's not just the vulnerability that exists today, but really historical processes that have resulted in people, particularly along the basin, along the Indus Basin, left in this kind of scenario. And so the West really needs to think about, or the global North needs to think about the ways in which reparations for historical vulnerability need to be linked up to climate vulnerability and a much more kind of overarching network of reparations that needs to be developed to deal with events like this.
Errol Yaboke, do nations owe reparations to countries facing climate disaster? And when you hear words like reparations and climate apartheid, how is that kind of language going to go over with many of those countries in the global North?
Thanks, Hazan, and I think it's a great question. In my job at CSIS, I like to focus on the practical, and what we really need here is for toxic emitters, those in the global North that, as my colleagues have mentioned, are disproportionately responsible for the negative effects of climate change, for those countries, including the United States, Britain, and others, to pay their fair share. I think from a practical standpoint, to me, it's more about preparation than just talking about reparations. We're talking about the future. Again, divorcing my personal opinions perhaps for a second from what I think will be effective in processes like COP27, we need to be talking about this sort of equitable justice, paying their fair share. I think language like reparations and apartheid are deliberately meant to shock, and I don't think that that's all bad. Personal opinion there. I think that this is meant to really point out the inequities that have disproportionately been the responsibility of the global North. I think, though, when we move past that into what can we do about this, I think we need to be talking about really practical preparations, not just reparations.
Shahzad Baraza, if I could come back to you on this, I know you mentioned this earlier a little bit, but you wrote a piece in for the British Guardian newspaper in which you talked quite a bit about the legacy of colonialism and what it's done to the situation in Pakistan, how those areas are governed. Just talk us through a little bit more of that and how that has contributed to how people have suffered in those flood-stricken areas.
Sure, yeah. The place where I lived there for 2 years, where I did field work in a part of Pakistan, South Punjab, which has been at the center of the current floods. That area has a long kind of history of engagement with specifically British colonialism. And when the British came, they did multiple things that I think set the conditions for that area to now be quite vulnerable to flood devastation. One, there was huge drain of resources through land taxation away from that region, often in also collaboration with local elites. And so there was also this generation of huge landed inequalities between local landlords who were created and supported by the British and the rest of the population, which is very poor, landless. And that condition, then when the floods, and there was floods that happened in the past, in the last century, and then the major floods before this one was in 2010. When the floods hit, it leaves these poor, landless populations without the resources to deal with floods, without alternative source savings to do something else, resettle somewhere else, whereas the local elites have estates, houses elsewhere where they can be protected from the floods. And so there's a long history of colonialism setting up certain conditions in these places that make then poor peasants vulnerable to the devastation of the floods.
All right, we're going to play a clip now of the UN Secretary General who visited some of those flood-stricken regions in Pakistan.
I have seen an epic human tragedy here in Pakistan, but I also have seen the future. As our planet continues to warm, all countries will increasingly suffer losses and damage from climate beyond their capacity to adapt. Today is Pakistan. Tomorrow, it could be your country, wherever you live. This is a global crisis. As the minister said, it demands a global response.
Aisha Siddiqui, if it is incumbent upon those countries, industrialized countries in the global north, to do more to help countries like Pakistan, how does this work in practice then?
So there is the whole loss and damage debate, right? And there need to be institutional systems kind of set up, because we know that this is the sticking point in the COP discussions, and we don't seem to move very kind of, that conversation doesn't seem to move along a lot. But also at the same time, and this is why the reparations conversation is so important, this really shouldn't be framed as some kind of charity or aid. The point of using the right language, of framing the narrative correctly is really important, because it is really about what is owed to people. It is about their right. And if they have been systematically exposed to vulnerability over a long history of hundreds of years, then we really are talking about what are they owed, what is their right. And in order to begin that process, of course, loss and damage can be a first step, but it really needs to go much beyond that. I mean, the estimate suggests that Pakistan's going to lose $30 billion or something from its the loss to the economy is going to be up to that tune. So really, do we think that loss and damage can cover everything within that umbrella? I think that needs to be pushed a lot further. And that's where the idea of reparations comes in.
All right, we're going to show some pledges of money that have already been made by some countries. The United States saying that they stand by Pakistan in hard times and are offering support to flood victims. In addition to $100,000 in immediate relief, the U.S. has announced another $1 million to build resilience against natural disasters, and we continue to work together to mitigate future impacts of the climate crisis. The UK saying that it has announced humanitarian support of up to $17 million to help Pakistan's flood response. Since then, the United States, through the U.S. Agency for International Development, has pledged an additional $30 million in humanitarian assistance. So as Aisha was saying there, Errol, humanitarian aid is one thing, and that can certainly help in the short term, but it needs to be a lot more than that, and it needs to be a lot more commitment in the longer term.
I think that's right, and I agree with Aisha in that this is not strictly a conversation about humanitarian aid. I think this is a conversation about what the role of the United States and the broader global north can do to support local systems in Pakistan that are adapting, that are trying to move into a new normal. Shabazz talked about the 2010 flood, and this is now 2 once-in-a-generation floods that have happened a decade apart. We're entering the realm of a new normal, right? And so what Aisha was talking about in terms of greater funding levels, absolutely. I mean, when you look at the response to the Ukrainian displacement crisis versus the response to the Pakistan crisis, there's no comparison. And I think that disparity has been pointed out by others, and I think is worth mentioning here, not to take away from our Ukrainian friends, but to just show that a lot more can and should be done for our Pakistani friends. But I think it's beyond that. I think it's just beyond the aid. I think it's technology transfer. I think it's moving local systems into this place of resilience. If we're thinking about it for New Orleans, we need to be thinking about it for Karachi and Lahore.
Shahzad Baraza, we mentioned in the introduction to this program about COP27, which is coming up later this year in Cairo, and that number is 27. So there were lots of other conferences before then. Various pledges were made, and most of them have not been lived up to. So I guess my question is, what leverage does the poorer South have to pressure the richer countries that are doing most of the polluting?
I think now now there is growing, I think, criticisms from below, social movements talking about climate apartheid. It's entered the mainstream, talking about reparations as well. That's entered the mainstream. And so I think now there is more kind of awareness of this. There is global north countries are facing more pressure to do something about this. And I think these reparations are not necessarily, Errol talked about being realistic, and I think these reparations, it's important to keep in mind that there's mechanisms already in place to deliver some of these reparations. People have talked about, for example, the IMF's special drawing rights. This is like an IMF coupon that exists that currently is distributed to the global north as coupons that, and global north central banks have them, and they can use those coupons. They don't use those coupons, but those coupons can be sold for money. And right now, those coupons are mostly with the global north because of how the IMF was set up. Now, reparation scholars are saying that special drawing rights can be redistributed to global south countries. So reparations can be implemented through existing institutional mechanisms. A second thing to keep in mind, I think, about reparations is that it's a starting point. It's not going to be it's not going to ameliorate everything, but it's a starting point to building, I think, and remaking a better world. And it's giving the resources to the global south to start that process of remaking not just the global south, but the entire globe entirely. And I think if the global south countries present it in that way, that it's future oriented, it's not about making the global north guilty, I think that can pressure in these negotiations. It can rechange and shift the conversation a bit around reparations and climate apartheid.
Aisha Siddiqui, if we just go back to Pakistan for a moment, what is the most immediate concern there as those floods continue and people there continue to blame the government for its handling of those floods?
So I'm obviously not on the ground, and I wouldn't be able to comment on kind of needs on the ground. But I think that from my understanding of the situation and the work that I did in Pakistan during the 2010 floods, there is something to be said about this time just after the heavy rains, where historically we've seen a lot of water kind of stagnate, and it's just around, and there's not there isn't a lot of place for it to go. It's just hanging about there, and I believe that currently too, especially in the lower Indus Basin, this has been raised in a few places. And I think there too, it's really important to highlight that there is a lot of research and work that has been done on the way in which these interventions of that accompanied British colonial rule in Pakistan, the systems along the canals and the barrages and the dams and the putting up of levees to block water from flowing into the river, and that system has very actively been continued. That kind of very modernist belief in mega projects and big technical solutions to resolving these problems. It's very actively been continued in the post-colonial period. So, for example, when I did my field work in Pakistan in 2010 in Lower Sindh, what a lot of my respondents felt caused them most damage, much more than the rains, was the left bank outfall drainage project on the left bank of the Indus, which suffered from all these backwater effects and seawater intrusion. So the whole system that Pakistan operates on flood management, or for flood management and for water control, water management, that really needs to be questioned and challenged and looked at from a much more indigenous and local perspective, rather than this very top-down modernist perspective that the British Raj left Pakistan with, and that Pakistan state planners kind of continued with full gusto.
Errol Yabuka, you see it that way as well? There needs to be less of a kind of top-down approach?
Absolutely, and we're seeing this not just in Pakistan. We see communities around the world having solutions that are ignored, perhaps because they weren't developed in some boardroom in Geneva or Washington or London. And I think there's a move in the United States, for example, to localize aid, and I don't know that I agree with that term fully, but I think the idea is to include local leaders and local communities in decision-making processes and planning. And I think what Aisha was talking about is exactly where we need to be moving. These local solutions that have existed for centuries, that were disregarded during and post-colonial times, I think need to be certainly listened to. There's an element of this conversation that I think hasn't been brought up, which is also important. And I frame this as an and, not an or. Yes, the global north needs to do more. Yes, we need to adapt. We need to listen to local communities. I think also the Pakistani authorities that are in place also need to make sure that the laws are on the books, the laws that are on the books are enforced, that for example, if a community is particularly flood prone after 2010, why did we build structures? Why were structures allowed to be built in really vulnerable places? And I think just doing a little bit of hard kind of inward soul searching from a Pakistani perspective is also something that I think could add value to this conversation, because again, if this is a new normal, we're going to have to figure out what that new normal is. And there might be some places, despite local efforts and local indigenous technologies and efforts, there will be places that might not be inhabitable or that might be really, really difficult to inhabit. And so if we're moving to a new system, if we're moving to a new place, and we have regulations in place, we have ways of protecting people, those have to be enforced. And I think that's certainly, there's a role to play for the international community, but I also think that that's certainly a Pakistani thing.
Aisha, how much of a role has corruption played in all of this, and could it continue to play in the future?
It's a very valid question, but I fear that it comes up almost too much. The idea that corruption is something quite unique, that only Pakistan or that only global South countries suffer from, is a really problematic assumption to make. All countries have systems through which people are able to influence policymakers, politicians, etc. In the US, they do it through their PACs and super PACs, and in the UK, there are a whole other kind of influence that elites are able to make on parliament. So I think to repeatedly kind of make corruption some kind of bugbear, that this is the reason why Pakistan cannot be provided with adequate assistance, or Pakistan just doesn't have the ability or the capacity to deal with it, is a hugely problematic statement to make, and one that's also really kind of laden with all sorts of imperial patronizing language.
Shahzad Baraza, if I could ask you about, you talked a little bit about corruption earlier, that it comes from all sides, from the colonial legacy, from within Pakistan as well. So what's the solution going forward then?
In terms of I just want to add one thing about the climate apartheid. So I think, without falling into the trap of simply calling Pakistani elites corrupt, I think there is an important point that local political elites in Pakistan are also responsible for what's happening, and it's also because of this history of their collaboration with imperialists and colonialism that I've talked about. That we have to also speak about internal forms of climate apartheid within nation states. So it's not simply between the global north and the south, but within countries of the global south. And Aisha's talked about how landlords have been able to often protect themselves, their estates, their land from flooding through their influence and power and influence over irrigation infrastructure. So there's climate apartheid within the global south, but there's also a climate apartheid and within the global north. And political elites in the global north are also kind of able to protect themselves in different ways. from the effects of floods. I mean, we can think of Hurricane Katrina, for example, or there's been studies in New York City about the racially segregated nature of heat wave deaths. Often black folks in New York City are more likely to die from heat waves than white folks, and that's because of the uneven distribution of air conditions. So I think it's important to speak about apartheids between the global north and south, and also within countries of the global north and the south as well. And I think that then moving forward will make the conversation of reparations less about guiltying the global north, but also looking at forms of inequality within countries as well. And there's the global north and the south has, I think, a lot to gain from a conversation about reparations.
All right, we're out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all three of you, Shaza Braza, Aisha Siddiqui, and Errol Yaboke. Thanks very much for being on Roundtable. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye, and thanks for watching.